The Trump administration says it will give diplomacy every chance to succeed before considering another way to deal with Iran. With more on Press Perspective today. Hello and welcome to Press Perspective for this Tuesday, May 26th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sun-hee. Later this week, we mark 3 months since the US and Israel launched a military offensive against Iran amid efforts to eradicate the latter's nuclear ambitions and more. For the latest, I have independent journalist Kelly Kasulis Cho with us. Kelly, welcome back.
Honored to be here, thanks.
I also have Professor Hannah Kim at Sogang University joining our talk virtually. Professor Kim, as always, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
Kelly, we start here in the studio. Let's begin with news of fresh U.S. strikes against southern Iran.
Yeah, so the U.S. Central Command said earlier that they have struck some alleged missile sites in Iran, as well as some kind of areas that were accused of attempting to plant landmines, if you will. The U.S. Central Command said that this was a necessary operation in order to maintain its defense and to, kind of do some damage control here. But I think the reason why this is at the top page of the New York Times and every major news outlet is essentially because it calls into question whether or not this is a setback for peace talks, on top of some already mixed messaging, whether you're looking at what the Americans are saying versus what the Iranians are saying about the progress that we're at with a potential peace deal. So it's really unclear right now if this strike will essentially be accepted as the U.S. Central Command is saying, an act that could not be helped for the sake of American defense, and whether that will be understandable or whether or not this will be considered a real threat to any progress that has been made recently in peace talks.
Right, and speaking about those peace talks, Kelly, what is the latest on that front?
It's hard to say, honestly. These are closed-door talks. Journalists like myself can really only look at the official messaging from various governments. So right before this happened, the Iranian Foreign Ministry had said, and again, this is before these strikes, they had said that some progress has been made in U.S.-Iran peace talks, but that a deal was, quote, not imminent, right? So they made it sound like we're not exactly that close yet. Meanwhile, the Trump administration before this was essentially saying that a deal has been essentially largely negotiated. I think that was the exact quote, largely negotiated is what President Trump said. Those are two very different messages, although it looks like they both at least agree that maybe they were getting closer to some kind of peace deal. The other monkey wrench in all of this is that President Trump earlier said that he would want certain nations to agree with the Abraham Accords as a prerequisite for some kind of peace deal. And so now this is getting really muddy because we're bringing in a lot of other nations that may or may not be willing to be a part of this. So for those who don't know, the Abraham Accords is basically an agreement, I believe from President Trump's first term, saying that they recognize Israel as a state. So it's about normalizing relations with Israel. I believe the UAE and Bahrain had already agreed to be a part of that in 2020, but President Trump mentioned Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Pakistan, Turkey, Egypt, and Jordan as potential countries that he would want to see kind of fall in line with that for there to be progress towards peace. So as you can see, it's almost like as if he's getting closer to this feeling that he has a peace deal on the table, and now he wants to get some last-minute gets, if you will. He's trying to make this a bigger and better package for himself. And it's not really clear in light of what's going on today if that's even on the table at this point.
Right. Professor Kim, in the course of this path to a peace deal, Mr. Trump has threatened and then retreated from many warnings of military strikes. Did this stance, or does this stance share a sense of strategic restraint, or does it signal a serious limit to his leverage, do you think?
I think it's a mix of both strategic restraint and serious limits to its leverage, but what we do know is that the balance has been tipping unfavorably for Washington. Trump's patterns throughout these negotiations has been to vacillate between what we would describe as saber-rattling rhetoric and signals of readiness for further talks. For example, he has been setting deadlines, extending them, and then also occasionally walking back on some of these deadlines. And in this sense, his mix of what we would describe as bluffing, extending and disappearing deadlines, and sudden attacks has led Tehran to refuse to trust the United States and trust that the United States would even keep a temporary ceasefire. So that erosion of credibility is a real cost at this point. And earlier this year, Trump gave Iran 10 to 15 days to agree on a nuclear deal. And he warned that failure to reach an agreement would be an unfortunate for Iran. Yet those deadlines passed without the promised consequences, and Iran's closure of the Strait of Hormuz has become its greatest strategic leverage over Washington. Now, this is something that no amount of rhetorical escalation has reversed. So when we look at it from this point of view, one could argue that Trump is practicing a form of what we would describe as madman theory, this idea that attempts or strategies to keep adversaries off balance is what he is utilizing. But what we're actually seeing in practice looks more like the limits of coercive pressures against an adversary that has more to lose from capitulation than from enduring pain. So in theory and in practice, it's quite different.
Right. In the meantime, Kelly, Mr. Trump's military campaign against Iran has been facing mounting opposition at home. That being said, do you suppose domestic, and by that I mean the U.S., political pressure look to perhaps shape the next phase of this conflict? And if that is the case, what might that picture look like, do you think?
Well, this mounting pressure is really showing itself in terms of polling and approval ratings for President Trump. So, I mean, there have been many moments throughout his 2 terms where he has met controversy. I'm thinking about the ICE raids and the death of 2 American citizens who were killed by federal agents. That was a really bad low point. It's even worse, according to some polls now. So President Trump has the lowest approval rating in his recorded history, so compared to his first term and also right now. I think there was a poll in the middle of this month that said that only 31% of Americans approve of what he's doing, how he's handling his job. 64% disapprove. That's his weakest showing yet. We're ramping up to the midterms. I mean, certain Democratic lawmakers are really talking about his performance in Iran as a way to persuade people away from the Republican Party. I think, he had this one blunder very recently where he said that he's not thinking about Americans' economic burden as he's going into this war, and that really did not serve well among his voter base and among the MAGA movement. If you look at the U.S. right now, I mean, we have a landscape where layoffs have hit their highest since the 2008 economic crisis. AI is really the only sector that is buoying the U.S. economy out of a recession. Trump definitely feels maybe some pressure to show a victory or package what's going on as a victory with Iran to kind of quiet this discontent. And just to show the connection, I mean, the Strait of Hormuz and the issue with the energy crisis, this is really at this point affecting an average American's bottom line. So what it's doing is it's bringing up the price of energy and oil, gasoline, which is bringing up the price of goods because a lot of American domestic farming, for instance, is actually on the West Coast in California, and a lot of the East Coast's food supply comes from there. So the cost of tomatoes, just as an example, has gone up 40%. I have American friends that were saying that they're paying $3 for 1 Roma tomato. I mean, that's almost like Korea prices right back in the day in terms of produce, and that's grown domestically. I mean, with Korea, a lot of it is actually imported. So you're talking about a cost of living crisis. That's really been the messaging coming from Senator Bernie Sanders in Vermont and other major Democratic opposition lawmakers. And while some, political analysts essentially say that Democrats can't celebrate this too soon, that they need to be careful, I do think that there is going to be pressure for President Trump to either find an off-ramp or try to spin what he's getting from Iran as some kind of political victory and exit. And the Iranians, on the other hand, may very well know that and use that to their advantage.
Right. Professor Kim, from a Korean perspective, does the conflict in the Middle East reinforce confidence in the U.S. alliance framework, or does it serve to perhaps raise doubts about U.S. reliability?
And to be frank, it seems like South Korea is running several calculations simultaneously regarding this, but the issue is that none of them are entirely reassuring at the moment. Now, the first we could imagine is a straightforward force posture concern. The United States repositioned some military assets from the Korean Peninsula to support operations in the Middle East. And I don't want to overstate this, but the redeployment of certain assets doesn't create an immediate security vacuum here. But it does prompt a legitimate question. In a genuine crisis on the peninsula, how quickly and fully would Washington be able to concentrate its attention and capabilities on Northeast Asia? And that kind of uncertainty regarding this question, even if it's manageable today, it's not something that Seoul can simply set aside at the moment. And another calculation, the second one, would be involve Pyongyang. And watching the United States attack Iran, a country that had not fully developed nuclear weapons, Kim Jong-un will almost certainly have drawn a stark lesson from this. Surrendering your nuclear arsenal is not a plan or is not a path to security. It's a path to vulnerability from the way that he would see it. So if anything, the Iran war has deepened Kim's conviction that his nuclear deterrent is non-negotiable. And that makes the already daunting challenge of denuclearization even more remote. So from Seoul's perspective, the Middle East conflict has inadvertently hardened the very problem South Korea needs to solve the most. And the third concern is about entrapment. So several Middle Eastern countries that hosted US bases have become targets of Iranian retaliation precisely because of that hosting relationship. So South Korea is home to nearly 28,500 American troops and serves as a critical node to the US Indo-Pacific posture. But the Iran war has made viscerally clear that the alliance commitments can carry a two-way risk, that being a frontline partner of the United States may invite threats that would not otherwise exist. And so this is a conversation Seoul has managed carefully, but it's now going to be even harder to avoid.
Right, and speaking about South Korea then, Kelly, as a foreign journalist based here in Seoul, what do you believe is the biggest concern for the Lee Jae-myung administration with regard to the conflict in the Middle East?
I think there's a lot going on, and it's hard to say which is the single largest issue. I mean, you have soaring energy prices, you've got issues with shipping and a largely export-driven economy, and those two issues feed each other because one of South Korea's greatest exports is obviously reliant on industry that needs this energy, semiconductor chips and the alike, appliances, electronic appliances, things like that. And then, as Professor Kim was talking about, you have this really difficult tightrope that South Korea is walking where engagement with North Korea has been a chronic issue. It certainly looks worse. South Korea has long relied on its alliance and really kind of raised that alliance to be an important part of Korean domestic politics. And now, as a frontline partner, there has been the question of why hasn't it helped the United States more on its front with Iran. I think South Korea has navigated that quite well, as has parts of Europe, but that challenge continues to exist. We saw recently President Trump kind of dithering on the question of Taiwan. That's also a serious issue that South Korea really has to look at carefully. But I mean, the situation as it stands, and we've been talking about it on the show for several months now, it's not looking great. I mean, 70% of crude oil comes through the Strait of Hormuz that South Korea is reliant on. So 70% of Korea's crude oil supply. There's been talk again and again about dealing with helium shortages, dealing with chemical shortages or component shortages that are important for things like South Korea's trash system. The Korean won is at a 17-year low. It's exceptionally bad right now, which has, kind of a chokehold on Koreans who are trying to do business abroad, the Koreans who want to travel, do tourism. I think Kospi recorded its worst ever performance in its 43-year history for a single session. So we're dealing with a situation where domestic politics is largely driven by economic concerns in North Korea, and this conflict is affecting both very greatly. And so it also plays into South Korea's broader issues with the population crisis, the birth rate. If people don't feel optimistic about their economic future, they're certainly not going to be, starting families if that's already been an issue in the last 20 or 30 years. If people are uncertain about the state of peace on the peninsula and the greater region, that's not going to have a great effect on business. It's a really destabilizing time. I don't know which the Lee Jae-myung administration should be looking at. I think they've been looking at them all. And I will say, at least on the foreign policy front, I think it's been a pretty good performance so far. South Korea's done a really good job at, kind of navigating this uncertain territory and carving a place on the international stage. But also, it's been good at kind of avoiding being noticed too much as well, I think, in terms of Washington seeking, help from its allies.
Right. And speaking about that, Professor Kim, I'd like to circle back to your talk about North Korea. Chinese leader Xi Jinping is expected to visit North Korea in the days ahead to sit down with Kim Jong-un. What do you believe will top their agenda?
I think they're going to have many different things to talk about, but several prominent issues are likely going to top the agenda. One major focus will likely be North Korea's relationship with the United States. Now, a separate government source has indicated that Xi Jinping could seek to mediate relations between Pyongyang and Washington. This would align with the broader diplomatic context. The fact that the U.S. fact sheet released following the Trump-Xi summit stated that the two leaders confirmed their shared goals to denuclearize North Korea, suggesting Washington may be encouraging Beijing to use this visit to facilitate dialogue. So in this sense, it could potentially be a mediating actor. But at the same time, Xi Jinping's visit is unlikely to be solely about serving as an intermediary for the United States or a messenger for President Trump. Beijing is increasingly concerned about North Korea's deepening military cooperation with Russia, including Pyongyang's reported provision of troops and weapons to support Moscow's war in Ukraine. And from China's perspective, there is growing concern about losing influence over North Korea as well, since as Pyongyang strengthens ties with Moscow. So as a result, reinforcing and stabilizing the China-DPRK relationship will likely be just as important as any discussion involving the United States. And President Xi Jinping will want to ensure that Beijing remains North Korea's primary strategic partner, rather than allowing Russia to become the dominant external actor shaping Pyongyang's calculations. So it seems as though even though the two will have a lot of things to talk about, balancing these relationships is going to be top priority.
All right, speaking about relationships, Kelly, Seoul has been actively pursuing talks with Washington last week. Could you walk us through some of the talks that have taken place and their relevance?
I will say, since Lee Jae-myung took office, South Korea's top diplomats have really been busy. It seems to be that South Korea is really being active and proactive, if you will, about its foreign policy. But a lot of the things that it's proposing are not necessarily earth-shattering, ground-shaking things. I think what they're doing is really seeking stability as well as a little bit of growth in terms of economic partnership. So what we know is that South Korea's vice foreign minister, in talks with Washington, essentially said that, they would like President Trump and the U.S.'s support on things like nuclear submarines, shipbuilding projects, nuclear energy projects. They've mostly gotten support, at least verbally, from the Trump administration about those initiatives in the past. Of them, the ones that have been making the news the most recently is obviously the nuclear submarines. Some of that, stirs up concern that it could kind of provoke some sort of arms race on the Korean Peninsula and in the Asia region more broadly. But like I said, President Trump has generally shown some kind of support for that. Shipbuilding cooperation, things like that have also been in the headlines. I think Korea, with its export-driven economy, is really trying to grow its presence as kind of a place of industry when it comes to defense. So, for instance, we talked about last week South Korea or Hanwha's bid to, have a big project with Canada's military. It would be, if they won, the biggest military deal in Canada's military history. It would be $12 billion plus for the South Korean economy, 20,000 jobs. So you really see, in this moment of kind of greater chaos, a lot of dialogue, but mostly about business and cooperation on that front, and less about some of the more fundamental choices from Washington about the war in Iran, what's been going on in Gaza, although Lee Jae-myung, the president, has certainly been vocal about some of the issues that have been going on in terms of Israel's conduct. But generally, you see kind of moves that are not trying to shake up these relationships, but really trying to create a stronghold of more kind of economic cooperation, more potential for, output for South Korea's GDP. And that might be the right rope to walk right now.
Right. And in the meantime, Professor Kim, how should South Korea seek to navigate the potential scenario of the U.S. re-engaging with North Korea?
So I think the Iran president cuts in complicated ways for North Korea. On the one hand, the emerging U.S.-Iran framework involves a 60-day ceasefire extension, sanctions relief negotiations, and eventual talks on curbing Iran's nuclear program. A phased transactional approach that Kim Jong-un will have studied closely. And so if Trump achieves even a partial agreement with Tehran, his team will likely pivot to North Korea with a similar playbook. And that's economic incentives in exchange for nuclear concessions. But on the other hand, since Pyongyang has bolstered ties with Moscow and Beijing, it is now far less motivated to engage Washington than it was during the first Trump administration, and has shown little appetite for inter-Korean engagement, as we've seen recently the past few years. And it has disavowed unification and flatly rejected Seoul's overtures. So Kim has learned from watching both the Libya model and the Iran experience that surrendering strategic assets offers no lasting security guarantee. So for Seoul, the navigation challenge is delicate. If Trump pursues a bilateral deal with Kim, potentially trading sanctions relief for a partial freeze rather than full denuclearization, South Korea risks being excluded from a process that directly determines its own security. And Seoul should actively be signaling to Washington that any arrangement on the peninsula must account for South Korean interests and inter-Korean dimensions. And President Lee Jae-myung, during his state visit to China in January, asked President Xi Jinping to help mediate inter-Korean relations. So that kind of multilateral diplomatic engagement, alongside firm alliance coordination with the United States, is Seoul's best hedge against being left out of decisions made about Korea, but without Korea.
Right, I see. Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for this edition. Professor Kim, as always, thank you so much for your insights today.
Thank you for having me.
And Kelly here in the studio, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts.
Thanks.
All right, that ends this edition of Press Perspective. As always, thank you for watching and see you back here same time tomorrow.